Part 1. The universe was old. It had burned and frozen and burned again across billions of years, and in all that time, one truth remained constant, that ruled everything. No one remembered when they first appeared. The oldest records of the oldest species spoke of them as already ancient, already supreme. They were not creatures of flesh or metal or energy in any way that other beings could understand. They were something else entirely. Some scholars believed they had existed before the first stars ignited. Others whispered that they had built the stars themselves, seeding the cosmos with light and heat for reasons no younger mind could grasp. What everyone agreed upon was simple. They were absolute. They did not negotiate. They did not explain. They did not ask. They simply ruled, and all others existed at their pleasure. Their method was elegant in its cruelty. Whenever a new species clawed its way up from the mud of its, whenever young minds looked up at distant stars and dreamed of reaching them, they waited. They watched with patience that spanned. They let these young species develop their first crude rockets, their first orbital stations, their first tentative colonies on nearby worlds. And then, when these hopeful creatures finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel, when they first punched a hole through the fabric of space and emerged light-years from home, they acted. A herald would come. Heralds were vast beyond comprehension. Each one was a living machine the size of a small moon, grown from materials that did not exist in normal space. They moved without engines that anyone could detect. They communicated through every method simultaneously: radio waves, light pulses, gravitational ripples, direct manipulation of neural tissue. When a herald arrived in orbit around a populated world, it blotted out the sun. Day became night. Oceans buckled under its gravitational pull. And then it spoke. The edict was always the same, translated perfectly into every language the target species had ever developed. Submit, serve, accept your place in the order of the cosmos. You will be given a function. You will be given a territory. You will be given limits beyond which you must not reach. In exchange, you will be permitted to exist. Most species submitted immediately. What choice did they have? The heralds carried weapons that could crack planets like eggs, that could ignite atmospheres into nuclear fire, that could simply unmake matter at the subatomic level. A few species had tried to fight over the billions of years. There were now asteroid fields, their names erased from every record. They did not preserve the memory of those who resisted. They simply removed them from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been. And so the cosmic order endured. The Chur, with their hive minds and delicate manipulator limbs, were assigned to maintain this biological archives, tending genetic records of every species that had ever lived and died. The beings of living gas who thought in electromagnetic frequencies were made to serve as the communication network, relaying messages across the galaxy in ways no physical signal could match. The Tarn, silicon-based creatures who felt no cold and feared no pressure, were sent to mine dead worlds and dying stars for materials they required. Each species had its place. Each species had its limits. A chur who grew too curious about forbidden knowledge would find its entire hive sterilized. A collective that questioned the content of the messages it carried would be dispersed into the void between stars. A Tarn who built something beyond its designated technology level would watch its burn. The system worked. It had worked for 12 billion years. It would work forever. Or so they believed. The species that called itself human emerged on an unremarkable rocky planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable spiral arm of a thoroughly unremarkable galaxy. By cosmic standards, they were nothing special. Their bodies were fragile sacs of water and carbon. Their minds were slow biological processors that aged and failed within a century. Their technology was laughably primitive, built from crude metals and simple chemicals. Sensors detected them when their first faster-than-light ship blinked into existence 20 light-years from there. The ship was tiny, barely larger than some of the autonomous repair drones. Its drive system was inefficient and unstable. Its crew of 7 biological organisms were already dying of radiation exposure from their own engine, but they had crossed the threshold. They had touched the stars, and so the edict must be delivered. A herald was dispatched, not a particularly large one, for humanity was not a particularly significant species. It arrived in the solar system that humans called their own and took up position between their world and their sun. Day turned to twilight across the planet they called Earth. Tides surged unpredictably. Millions looked up at the sky in terror at the shape that hung there, blocking out the light of life itself. The herald broadcast the edict. It used every language it had decoded from human communications: English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, and hundreds more. It painted the words across their primitive digital networks. It vibrated the bones of every human being so they would feel the message even if they could not hear it. Submit, serve, accept your place. You will mine asteroids in your local system. You will not expand beyond the boundaries we set. You will provide biological samples for our archives. You will not develop weapons beyond the yield we specify. You will exist as we permit you to exist, or you will not exist at all. The herald waited for the response that always came: the despair, the frantic attempts to fight that would be crushed, the eventual, inevitable surrender. It had delivered this message to 10,000 species. It knew how this story ended. For 3 days, there was silence from the planet below. Then the humans responded. Their message was not surrender. It was not despair. It was not even defiance in any form the herald's ancient programming could recognize. Instead, their transmission contained something the herald had to process for several seconds before it could categorize it. The humans were laughing. Their laughter came in waves across every frequency they could broadcast. It was not the hysterical laughter of creatures whose minds had broken under impossible pressure. It was genuine amusement. Billions of humans were laughing at the herald, at the edict, at the entire concept of surrender. Then came words. "We appreciate the communication," the human message said. "We have reviewed your proposal and have some concerns about the terms. We would like to request a meeting with your supervisory authority to discuss alternative arrangements. Please advise on the appropriate point of contact for escalation. Also, does your organization have a complaints department? We have feedback." The herald did not understand. This was not among the responses. It broadcast the edict again, increasing the power until buildings shook and windows shattered across the human world. "Yes, we received that," the humans replied. "We've forwarded it to our legal department for review. In the meantime, we have prepared a counter-proposal. Would you prefer it in writing or would you like to schedule a call? We're flexible on format." The herald reported to the council for the first time in 60 million years. The council, ancient beyond measure, took 17 hours to process the report. They had never encountered such a response. They instructed the herald to demonstrate consequences. A small human colony on the 4th planet of their system was targeted. The herald fired a warning shot that turned 300 square kilometers of red desert into glass. 47 humans died. Earth's response arrived within hours. "We acknowledge receipt of your demonstration and have filed a formal protest with the relevant authorities. We would also like to inform you that we have established a memorial fund for the victims and named the affected region Remembrance Plain. Tourist visits will begin next fiscal quarter. Additionally, we have scheduled a candlelight vigil that will be visible from orbit. You are invited to observe if you wish to understand the cultural significance of what you have done. We remain open to dialogue and look forward to a productive relationship." The herald did not know what a tourist was. It did not know what a vigil was. It did not understand why humans would respond to death by inviting their killers to watch them mourn. The concept of a formal protest was meaningless when they recognized no authority but themselves. And yet the humans spoke as if they believed their protest mattered, as if they believed their invitation might be accepted. For the first time in 12 billion years, a herald requested additional guidance. For the first time in longer than recorded history, though we're uncertain what guidance to give. Something had changed in the universe. Something small and fragile and laughably brief had looked at the absolute order of the cosmos, had heard the edict that had crushed 10,000 species before it, and had responded with amusement and counter-proposals and formal complaints. They did not yet know what to make of humans. They would learn. Part 2. The council met in a place that existed between dimensions. No physical being could survive there. No machine could function in its impossible geometries. It was a space designed for minds that had transcended matter billions of years before the first planets formed. And in all that time, the council had never faced a problem it could not immediately solve. Until now. The human problem refused to resolve itself. It did not escalate into war that could be cleanly ended. It did not surrender into obedience that could be managed. It simply continued, spreading like a strange infection through the ordered cosmos, following rules they could not identify and pursuing goals they could not comprehend. Human diplomats arrived at every station they could reach, not with weapons, not with threats, with documents. Endless documents filled with proposals and frameworks and something they called mutually beneficial partnership opportunities. When told that negotiation was not possible, they nodded politely and said they would wait until it became possible. Then they set up small encampments in station corridors, brewed a bitter hot drink they called coffee, and waited. They were still waiting, generations later. That was the first thing that disturbed the human were nothing. A century at most, often less. A negotiator could simply wait for a troublesome opponent to die of old age, then continue discussions with successors who had lost the thread of argument. This technique had worked on hundreds of species. It did not work on humans. A human diplomat named Sarah spent 40 years arguing for trade rights with a representative. She grew old at the negotiating table, her hair turning white, her movements slowing, her voice growing thin. On the day she died, peacefully in her sleep in the small quarters she had been assigned, her daughter Maya took her seat the following morning. Maya had the same notes, the same proposals, the same patient smile. And she had something more. 40 years of her mother's letters describing every detail of the negotiation, every nuance of behavior, every tiny advantage that might be pressed. Maya negotiated for another 37 years. When she died, her son Thomas continued. The representative, who had not aged a single moment in that time, found itself facing the same argument it had faced a century before, refined and strengthened by 3 generations of human thought. The humans called this institutional memory. They treated time not as an endurance test to be won by the longest lived, but as a relay race where each runner passed the baton to the next. And they had been running relays since before they discovered fire. The second disturbance was worse. Human traders appeared in restricted sectors of space, regions where no species was permitted without explicit authorization. When intercepted, they produced documents showing complex chains of reasoning that technically, arguably, possibly permitted their presence under obscure clauses of the edict that had never been tested. While administrators debated whether to destroy them or simply expel them, the humans opened their cargo holds and began selling. They did not sell weapons. They did not sell technology. They sold things far more dangerous. They sold music. The Chur were the first to fall. Their hive minds were built for efficiency, for processing vast amounts of genetic data, for maintaining archives across. Entertainment was not part of their function. It was not permitted. And yet somehow, a human trader convinced a Chur researcher to accept a small device containing something called classical music. The researcher listened once in secret, then twice. Then she shared it with her hive cluster. Within a decade, was spreading through Chur space like a virus. Hive clusters that had never communicated except for work purposes began exchanging favorites. Arguments broke out over whether or better captured the mathematical beauty of the universe. A Chur philosopher wrote a treatise on how 4 seasons reflected the patterns of 17 different species, and it became the most document in Chur history. They did not know what to do. The Chur were still performing their function. Their archive work continued without interruption, but they were also doing something else now, something that had no purpose, no efficiency, no place in the cosmic order. They were enjoying themselves. The fell next. As beings of living gas who thought in electromagnetic frequencies, they had always experienced human radio transmissions as a kind of background noise. But when humans began deliberately broadcasting something called jazz directly at communication relays, the effect was immediate. Jazz was chaotic. It was unpredictable. It broke rules and made new ones and broke those too. It was everything that had been forbidden to be. They became addicted. Not physically, but something deeper. Collectives began requesting assignment to sectors where human broadcasts were strongest. They started improvising. Their communications, which had been perfectly standardized for billions of years, began to include variations and embellishments and something that could only be called style. A senior coordinator, when questioned about this deviation from protocol, responded in a way that had never been recorded in history. It said, "I wanted to." The Tarn were harder to reach. Silicon-based, methodical, built for mining and construction, they seemed immune to human cultural exports. Music meant nothing to them. Art was incomprehensible, but humans were persistent, and eventually they found the right approach. They introduced the Tarn to games. Not simple games, complex games. Games with strategies and counter-strategies and meta-strategies. Games where the rules could be learned but never fully mastered. Games where winning required creativity, adaptation, thinking beyond the obvious path. The Tarn had been following instructions for so long that they had forgotten they could think for themselves. The games reminded them. Within a generation, Tarn mining crews were competing in tournaments during their rest cycles. They were forming teams, developing rivalries, creating new games of their own. They were thinking about problems that had no assigned solution, no correct answer, no purpose except the joy of thinking itself. All of this was reported to the council. All of it was analyzed and discussed and debated in the space between dimensions, and none of it led to any useful conclusion. They could destroy the humans. That remained trivially easy. A single command and Earth would become a burned cinder in space. Human colonies would be tracked down and eliminated. Every trace of human culture would be erased. But that would not erase what humans had already done. The Chur would still remember music. They would still have learned to improvise. The Tarn would still know that thinking could be its own reward. The infection was already spreading. Destroying the source would not cure the disease. For the first time, they faced an enemy they could not kill into submission. And then something even more troubling happened. One of their own changed. They called it 17 resonance, a designation that meant nothing in physical languages. It was old even by standards, one of the original minds that had shaped the cosmic order in the youth of the universe. It had never questioned. It had never doubted. For 12 billion years, it had been exactly what it should be. Then it made direct contact with humanity. The meeting was meant to be a final warning before decisive action. 17 resonance descended to Earth itself, manifesting in a form that human senses could perceive. A figure of light and shadow that stood at the center of their largest city. Millions watched. The whole species held its breath. 17 resonance delivered the ultimatum. Full submission within 1 local year or total destruction. A human walked forward from the crowd. She was small and old, wrapped in colorful fabric, carrying a container of tea. She looked up at the cosmic being that could end her world with a thought, and she smiled. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked. "You've come a long way, you must be tired." 17 resonance did not feel tiredness. It did not need rest. The offer was absurd. And yet something in the way she asked it, Something in the genuine kindness of her voice made 17 residents pause. They talked for 7 hours. The old woman asked questions. Simple questions. Why do you rule? What do you want? Are you happy? 17 residents had never been asked if it was happy. It had never considered the question. Happiness was not a concept. Purpose was. Order was. But happiness, what would that even mean for a being that had existed since before stars? When 17 residents returned to the council, it brought something it had never brought before: uncertainty. And with uncertainty came something even more dangerous. It brought a question. Why do we rule? The council had no answer. They had never needed one. They were beginning to realize that they might need one now. Part 3. The war began not with weapons, but with silence. In 1,000 systems across the galaxy, the machinery of control depended on the willing service of conquered species. The Chur processed information. The transmitted orders. The Tarn built and mined and maintained. Without them, they would have to do these things themselves, and they had not done such things in billions of years. They had forgotten how. Perhaps they had never truly known. When the order came to destroy humanity, the Chur archive tenders received it through proper channels. They acknowledged receipt. They logged the command in their records. And then, for the first time in their history as a species, they asked a question. Why? The question was not permitted. The Chur were not supposed to ask why. They were supposed to obey. But a generation of humans selling music in restricted space had taught them something dangerous. That rules existed because someone made them, and what one mind could make, another mind could question. They repeated the command. The Chur asked the question again. Why destroy the humans? They have not harmed us. They have not broken any law that makes sense. They have given us in something called the blues that makes us feel things we never knew we could feel. Why should we help you kill them? They had no answer that would satisfy a species that had learned to ask questions. They had only the answer they had always given, because we command it, because we rule, because the order of the cosmos requires it. The Chur, who had spent a century discussing whether Fifth Symphony represented triumph over adversity or simply the joy of existence, found this answer unsatisfying. They did not refuse the order directly. They simply found that they were very busy with archive maintenance, essential tasks that could not be delayed. They would certainly get to the destruction orders eventually, but there was so much filing to be done. The response was more direct. When asked to transmit targeting coordinates for human colonies, their communication networks experienced what they called technical difficulties. The difficulties were very specific. Mundane administrative messages flowed perfectly. Supply requests and maintenance schedules and routine reports moved through space without delay. But anything related to attacking humans seemed to get lost somehow, scattered into noise, transformed into fragments of jazz that played through receivers in an endless loop. An administrator demanded an explanation. The collective responded with a saxophone solo. The Tarn were the final piece. Their mining fleets had been ordered to cease all shipments to human space and redirect resources to weapons platforms. Instead, the fleets continued on their original courses, delivering raw materials to the human shipyards that had been built in secret over decades. When confronted, the Tarn fleet commander explained that she was following orders, just not orders. "We have been thinking," she said, using a phrase that had not been recorded in Tarn speech for millions of years. "We have been playing games that teach us to think about strategy, and we have realized something. They are not good at games. They have never had to be. They have always won by being bigger and older and more powerful. But games have taught us that power is not the same as strategy, and we have decided to play a different game. That could still destroy all of them. The Council held enough power to burn every world that them, to sterilize every species that had been corrupted by human influence. They could reset the cosmic order through fire and death, as they had done before when younger species grew too ambitious. But something had changed in the council itself. 17 Resonance was not the only asking questions now. Others had begun to wonder. An old woman on Earth had asked if they were happy, and the question had spread like the human music, passing from mind to ancient mind, finding no answer but refusing to go away. Were they happy? Had they ever been? Or had they simply existed, maintaining an order that had no purpose except its own continuation, ruling because they had always ruled, crushing because they had always crushed? The humans had lived for only a few 100,000 years. Their individual lives lasted less than a century. By standards, they were barely a flicker, a brief spark that would burn out and be forgotten. And yet in that tiny span, they had created music that made ancient beings weep. They had invented games that taught conquered species to think. They had asked questions that shook the foundations of a 12-billion-year empire. What had they created in their endless existence? What had they built that was not a weapon or a prison or a tool of control? They could not remember. The final confrontation took place on Earth, in the same city where 17 Resonance had first met the old woman with tea. She had died years ago, peacefully, surrounded by family, leaving behind letters and stories, and a recipe for the tea that she had hoped the cosmic being might one day try. The who descended now was not 17 Resonance alone. It was a fusion of many minds, the closest thing the council could manage to a unified voice. It came to deliver judgment, but it was no longer certain what that judgment should be. The human who came to meet it was young by human standards, middle-aged by the reckoning of her brief species. Her name was great-granddaughter of the diplomat Sarah, who had spent 40 years arguing for trade rights. She carried a tablet computer, a thermos of coffee, and a worn notebook that had been passed down through 4 generations of her family. "You've come to destroy us," she said. It was not a question. "We have come to decide," they answered. Nodded, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down on a bench in the plaza, as if she had all the time in the universe, which, given the circumstances, she might not. "Can I ask you something first?" The waited, asking was not forbidden even now. "What do you actually want?" asked. "Not what you've always done, not what the order of the cosmos supposedly requires. What do you right now actually want?" It was the question the old woman had asked, refined by generations of human diplomats who had thought about how to phrase things, how to reach minds that were older than stars. It was a simple question. It should have had a simple answer. They did not have one. They had wanted order. They had wanted control. They had wanted the cosmos to be predictable, manageable, safe from the chaos that had existed before they shaped it. But why had they wanted these things? What purpose did they serve? What were they protecting, and from what and for whom? They could not remember. Perhaps they had never known. "We wanted to matter," they finally said, and the words surprised them as much as they surprised. "We wanted our existence to have meaning." "And does it?" asked. "Has ruling everything given you meaning?" Silence. "Here's the thing about humans," said, sipping her coffee. "We die. We know we're going to die from the moment we're old enough to understand what death means. We have maybe 80 years if we're lucky, and that's nothing, that's barely a heartbeat compared to you. But we've figured out something important. Meaning doesn't come from controlling things. It doesn't come from lasting forever. It comes from mattering to someone, from creating something that makes someone else's existence a little better. From being remembered not because you were powerful, but because you were kind." She opened her tablet and showed the something. It was a document, the same document her great-grandmother had first presented nearly a century ago. A proposal for a galactic federation, equal membership, shared decisions. No masters, no servants, just different species working together because they chose to. "My great-grandmother wrote this," said. "She knew she'd never see it accepted. So did my grandmother. So did my mother. But they kept working on it anyway, adding to it, improving it, passing it down. Because they believed that someday someone would be ready to listen." She looked up at the cosmic being that held the power of life and death over her entire species. Are you ready? They could destroy her. They could destroy her world, her species, every trace of the infection that humans had spread across the cosmos. They could return to the old order, the old control, the old meaningless eternity of rule without purpose. Or they could do something they had never done in 12 billion years of existence. They could choose to become something else. We do not know how to do what you are asking, they said. We have been what we are for longer than your species can comprehend. Change is not something we understand. That's okay, said. We'll help. That's what we do. We're really good at helping people figure out who they could become if someone just believes in them. She held out her tablet with the proposal. You want to matter, here's your chance. Not as rulers, not as destroyers, as members, as partners, as friends maybe, if you're willing to learn what that means. They looked at the document, at the woman, at the city around them, full of humans living their brief and precious lives, creating and laughing and loving and dying and somehow, impossibly, refusing to despair. They made their choice. It was not surrender. It was not defeat. It was something that they had never experienced before, something that had no name in their ancient language. Later, humans would give it a name. They called it beginning. The cosmic order was over. The cosmic partnership was starting. And for the first time in 12 billion years, the universe was going to find out what it could become when fear gave way to wonder, when control gave way to trust, when the question, why do we rule, was finally answered with, we don't have to. Finished her coffee and smiled. Welcome to the Federation, she said. We've got a lot of work to do.